Hello everyone, my name is Arkajyoti Chowdhury and I am going to present a PowerPoint presentation about pollination, which is a very important topic for class 7. Now pollination, it is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anther, which you know is the male part of a flower, to the stigma, which is the female part of the same or another flower. And pollination, it always occurs between plants of same species. If the species are different, then there will be no pollination. Like consider an example as mango. If the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of mango to the stigma of another plant, like say papaya, then there will be no pollination. The pollen grains have to be transferred to the stigma of the flower of another mango plant. Okay, and now we come to the importance. Pollination, it helps in the reproduction of flowering plants, to formation of seeds and fruits. Number two is that it produces foods for humans and animals, because the seeds and fruits which are produced through pollination, they are consumed as food by humans and animals. And it maintains genetic diversity within plant population, because pollination produces a large and diverse variety of plants, so it maintains the genetic diversity within plant population. And pollination, it also helps to maintain the water, oxygen and carbon cycle, and in this way it helps in maintaining an environmental balance. It also absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen, thereby increasing its content. And it also purifies rainwater and prevents soil erosion. So pollination is a very important for our environment. Now let us come to the types of pollination. There are two types of pollination. One is self-pollination and the other is cross-pollination. Now self-pollination, it is the process where pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower. So within the same flower, pollination takes place. And cross-pollination, it is the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So two different flowers are involved. The pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. Now self-pollination, you can see that it occurs in dioecious plants. What are dioecious plants? The plants which contains both the male and female sexual parts on the same flower. So single flower, it has both the anther and the stigma, so that the pollination can take place in the same flower, like peas, lettuce, etc. And cross pollination, it occurs in flowers which are genetically different. We call those plants as monoecious, that is, they have different flowers for male and female. So of course two different flowers are involved. Example is pumpkins, apples, etc. Number three is self-pollination. Self-pollinating plants are less dependent on external factors for pollination, and cross-pollinating plants are more dependent on external factors for pollination. Because since the self-pollinating plants, where pollination occurs within the same flower, so they do not have to depend much on external factors like insects, birds, or wind, water, etc. for pollination, which the cross-pollinating plants have to depend. Now here you can see a diagram that explains the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. So here the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of this flower to the stigma of the same flower. In the first flower, see, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma, same flower. Similarly, in the second flower, if the pollen grains were transferred from the anther to the stigma, then it would also have been self-pollination. But since you can see here in the picture that the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of first flower to the stigma of the second flower, then it is cross-pollination, because two different flowers are involved. Similarly, if the pollen grains were transferred from the anther of the second flower to the stigma of the first flower, then also it would have been cross-pollination. Now a question may arise that the second flower has both anther and stigma, so why not self-pollination occurs? Well, there are a variety of reasons. One is that a barrier may be present in the flower which prevents self-pollination, such as the stigma may not mature when the anther gets matured, and so the pollen grains, it has no place to attach, so it has to attach on another flower. Okay, now here you can see about the agents of pollination. Now, agents of pollination, there are mainly four agents. Okay, one is wind, and pollination by wind is called anemophily. What happens here? The pollen grains, they are carried by the wind or air currents, and this is employed by certain plants like coconut, maize, etc. So say there are some characteristics which helps in this process. One is that the pollen grains, they are very light and dry, so that they can be easily carried by the winds. The anther and the stigma, that is the male and female parts, they are exposed to the air currents, as these plants have reduced or almost no petals. So the anther and stigma, they are directly exposed to the air currents, and so when the wind blows, the pollen grains are uh, carried from the anther, and they float through the air and then land on the stigma, which are rough and sticky, so the pollen grains can attach easily. Here you can see a picture where the flower, the anther, they release these pollen grains when the wind blows, and these pollen grains, they are carried by the winds. Now, in the next slide, you will see a video. So here, you can see a video which explains the entire process of wind pollination or anemophily beautifully. See this video. So here the pollen grains, when the wind is blowing, you can see that the pollen grains, they are carried by from the anther, and see here the pollen grains are light, and so they are floating in the wind and carried by the air currents. They travel for long distance or maybe short distance. And now see this stigma, okay? They have sticky surface, so that the pollen grains can easily attach themselves. So here one pollen grain has attached, more than one pollen grain may also attach to the stigma. All right. Now we come to the next agent of pollination, which is water. So pollination by water is called hydrophily. What happens here? The pollen grains, they are carried or distributed by the water currents, and it is a strategy which is employed by certain algae, bryophytes, and pteridophytes, so that their genetic material are transferred. And these flowers, they are small and do not have much color or fragrance on their petals. Some flowers like lotus, they are also aquatic, but they are pollinated by insects, so they are not a part of the plants which employ hydrophily as the process of pollination. Okay, so this hydrophily is employed mainly by plants which are small flowers, and these flowers, they have no color or fragrance, and examples are algae, bryophytes, etc. The pollen grains, they have a mucilaginous covering that protects them, and they are adapted to float on the surface of water. Here also the stigma, it may float on the water surface at the time of pollination, so that pollen grains can easily get attached to it. Now here comes pollination by insects or entomophily. So here the pollen grains, they are transferred by different insects like bees, moths, butterflies, etc. And they are employed by certain plants like rose, jasmine, marigold, etc. The main features of the flowers of these plants is that these flowers are large and attractive. They have very bright colors, and they also emit fragrance and secret nectars. All these things like color, fragrance, nectar, etc., they attract insects towards these flowers, and the insects, they get attracted towards the flowers and land on the flowers. Now if they land on the anther, then the pollen grains, they have sticky or spiny extensions which helps them to get attached to the bodies of the insects. And when the insects, they fly and sit on the female flower, then the pollen grains from their bodies get attached to the stigma. In this way, pollination takes place by insects. Now in the next slide, you will see an animated content and a video which beautifully shows this process of insect pollination. Here you can see this
or insect
animated
pollination.
content, and
This
here
type
there
of
is a video.
pollination takes place with the help of insects.
Listen carefully to this video.
It is the most common and specialized method of pollination. Insects visit plants for nectar, in search of fragrance, or even to take shelter. They bring about pollination. Majority of insect pollinated flowers are large, brightly colored, fragrant and rich in nectar.
See
Insects
how
are
these
attracted to
insects, they are
flowers
attracted by
by
the
their
flowers
color
and they
and
are
fragrance.
drinking its nectar.
The odor produced can be pleasant or foul. Some flowers, like arum and rafflesia, produced foul odor to attract insects like flies and beetles. In order to sustain frequent insect
And
visits,
when this happens, the
the
pollen grains,
flowers
they get attached
reward
to
these
the legs and the
insects
bodies of the
with
insects.
abundance of nectar and pollen
Now they are
grains.
flying and they are
When the
landing
insects visit
on
these
the stigma. If they
flowers,
land on the anther,
their
then there will be
body
no
gets
pollination.
coated
But
with
here
pollen
it is landing on the
grains.
stigma.
And
So
these
now the
pollen
pollen grains from its
grains,
bodies,
when
see
come in
how they are
contact with the
getting
stigma,
attached to the
bring
stigma.
about
In this way,
pollination.
pollination takes place by insects.
Some flowers are pollinated by bees. Bee pollinated flowers are blue or
Now here
yellow.
is are some
Pollen
features
grain
of the
are
flowers which are
often used
pollinated
as
by
food
bees,
by bees.
because a large number of flowers are
Hence,
indeed pollinated
large
by
number
bees.
of pollen grains is produced by such.
Now the last agent of pollination is the birds, and pollination by bird is called ornithophily. So here the pollen grains are transferred by birds like hummingbird, sunbird, etc. And they are mainly employed as a strategy for pollination by tropical plants like orchid, wildflowers, etc. Now the main features of these flowers is that they are attractive with colorful, often red petals, and have long tubular structures holding ample nectar. Okay, so these flowers, they are mainly red in color and they're tubular, so that they have much nectar. And the birds which are involved in ornithophily, they are specialized nectarivores. Nectarivores means they drink nectar of flowers. They have long bills which enables them to penetrate into the tubular structure of the flower to drink nectar, and are capable of hovering flight or are light enough to perch on the flower structure. Hovering flight means they can fly at the same place rapidly, which hummingbirds do. So these birds pollinated flowers differ from the insect pollinated flowers to some extent, because insect pollinated flowers, there is no such criteria that they have to be tubular or red in color. But these bird pollinated flowers, they are often tubular, so that the birds can drink the nectar and are red in color. And these flowers, they mainly secret nectar which the birds drink and so are attracted towards the flowers. But the insect pollinated flowers, they emit fragrance, bright and are bright in color, and also contain nectar which attracts the insects. So here we are discussing about the summary of what we have learned. Now pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same or another flower. Pollination, it always occurs between plants of same species. It helps in the reproduction of flowering plants and maintains genetic diversity within plant population. There are two types of pollination, as we have learned: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is common in dioecious plants, which contain both male and female sexual parts on the same flower, and cross-pollination is common in monoecious plants, that is in flowers which are genetically different from each other. And there are various agents of pollination, such as wind, and pollination by wind is called anemophily. Water, pollination by water is called hydrophily. Insects, pollination by insects is called entomophily. And birds, pollination by birds is called ornithophily. So this concludes our lesson about pollination, and hopefully this lesson about pollination has taught us a great deal about how the process is and how it is carried on by different agents. So here, this concludes the lesson about pollination. Thank you.